Governments run experiments on their own citizens, not in secret bunkers, not in classified facilities hidden from every record, in hospitals, in prisons, in state schools for disabled children, in the open air above American cities. With federal funding, university backing, and the approval of surgeons general and cabinet secretaries. The 10 cases in this series are not conspiracy theories. Every single one is confirmed through congressional records, presidential apologies, declassified government documents, peer-reviewed research, or federal court proceedings. Some produced financial settlements. Some produced formal apologies from sitting presidents. None produced criminal convictions for the people who ran them. The subjects are consistent across every case. Poor people, Black Americans, prisoners, children with disabilities, psychiatric patients, foreign nationals in countries where U.S. researchers calculated they could operate without legal consequence. The program spanned from 1932 to the early 1970s. Some run simultaneously. Some are connected by the same personnel, the same funding agencies, and the same institutional logic. This is the documented record. Case 01, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. Macon County, Alabama, 1932. 600 black men. No real doctors, no real treatment, no truth. The U.S. Public Health Service tells them they are being treated for bad blood. That is what people in Macon County call it, bad blood. It covers everything: fatigue, anemia, syphilis. The men do not know which one they have. The doctors do not tell them. That is the point. 399 of the 600 have syphilis. The other 201 do not. Both groups are being watched. The ones with syphilis are being watched to see what the disease does to a human body when nothing stops it. No medicine, no intervention, just observation, all the way to the autopsy table. The men are sharecroppers. Most have never seen a doctor before. The government offers them something almost none of them have ever had access to: free medical exams, free meals, and burial insurance. In Macon County in 1932, burial insurance is not a small thing. It means your family will not have to scramble to put you in the ground. Men sign up. Macon County sits in the Black Belt of Alabama. In 1932, it is one of the poorest counties in the United States. The majority of the population is black. Sharecropping is the dominant way of life. Men farm land they do not own, give most of what they grow to the landowner, and keep barely enough to survive. Medical care is not something most of these men have ever had regular access to. Black patients in Alabama in the 1930s are treated, when they are treated at all, in separate and inferior facilities. Syphilis rates in Macon County are among the highest documented anywhere in the country at the time. The USPHS knows this. A 1930 survey of the area finds high infection rates and almost no treatment infrastructure. The USPHS had already run a short syphilis treatment program in the area before the study began, one that actually gave men some medicine. That program ended. What replaced it was something entirely different. The study is designed by Dr. Taliaferro Clark of the USPHS and gets running in 1932 under Dr. Raymond Vonderlehr. The stated goal is to document the natural progression of untreated syphilis in black men over a long period of time. There is a deeply racist assumption underneath that goal. Some researchers in this period believe, without scientific basis, that syphilis affects black bodies differently than white bodies, and that studying it in this population will produce useful data. That belief is used to justify the study. It justifies nothing. The men recruited are told they are being treated. They are not. They are given placebos and occasional aspirin. They receive free meals on the days they come in for examinations. They receive burial insurance. The painful spinal taps used to extract fluid from their spinal columns for testing are described to them as a form of special free treatment. The letter the USPHS sends to get them to show up for those spinal taps is titled, "Last Chance for Special Free Treatment." The men come in. By 1947, the situation changes in a way that makes everything that follows impossible to defend. Penicillin is confirmed as an effective cure for syphilis. The medical community accepts this broadly. It becomes standard treatment. The U.S. military begins treating its own soldiers with it. This is not experimental or uncertain. It is a working cure, available, documented, and in use across the country. The men in Macon County do not receive it. The USPHS makes a deliberate decision to continue the study without penicillin. To give the men the cure would end the study. The researchers want to track the disease all the way to death and autopsy. Giving the men penicillin would interfere with that, so the men are not given it. This is the line. Before 1947, there is a real argument, ugly but real, that the study was designed in an era when treatment options were limited. After 1947, that argument does not exist. From 1947 onward, the men in Macon County are being actively denied a cure that the U.S. government is giving to other Americans. They are being left to get sicker and die, so researchers can observe what happens to their bodies. The USPHS goes further. Officials contact local physicians in Macon County and instruct them not to treat the study participants. When the U.S. enters World War II and the military begins identifying and treating syphilis in soldiers, USPHS officials work to ensure the men in the Tuskegee study are excluded from those treatment programs. Men who would otherwise have been treated are specifically kept out of treatment because they are enrolled in the study. The men still do not know what is being withheld from them. Dr. John Heller serves as director of the USPHS Venereal Disease Division from 1943 to 1948. His recorded view of the participants is direct. He states that the men's status did not warrant ethical debate. They were subjects, not patients. Clinical material, not sick people. That is the institutional attitude running the program during its most critical years. The study runs for 40 years, 1932 to 1972. 4 decades. Multiple U.S. presidents serve and leave office. World War II begins and ends. The Korean War. The Civil Rights Movement reshapes American law. The moon landing happens. Through all of it, 600 men in Macon County are being observed, examined, and left without treatment. By the time the study ends, the human cost is documented in precise numbers. 28 men died directly from syphilis. 100 more die from complications the disease causes. 40 wives are infected. 19 children are born with congenital syphilis, the disease passed from mother to child during pregnancy or birth. The children volunteered for nothing. Neither did the wives. The study survives as long as it does, partly because it is not widely known outside the medical and government circles running it. It is occasionally written about in medical journals under clinical language that does not convey to an outside reader what is actually being done to these men. It is framed as a study of untreated syphilis, without making clear that treatment is being actively withheld from people who could be cured. Peter Buxton is a public health worker who joins the USPHS in the 1960s. He reads about the study and raises objections internally in 1966 and again in 1968. Both times his objections are dismissed. USPHS officials defend the study. Buxton leaves the agency. He keeps the documents. In 1972, he gives those documents to a journalist named Jean Heller at the Associated Press. She investigates and publishes the story on July 25, 1972. It runs across the country the following day. The public learns for the first time what has been happening in Macon County for 40 years. The government terminates the study 4 months later, in November 1972. Charlie Pollard is one of the men in the study. He is a farmer. He joins in the 1930s believing he is getting medical care. He is in the study for decades before he learns the truth by reading about it in a newspaper in 1972. He is still alive when the story breaks. He later says he felt like he had been used as a guinea pig. Herman Shaw is another participant who survives long enough to hear an apology. He is in his 90s in 1997. He is the man who sits on the stage at the White House when President Bill Clinton stands at a podium on May 16, 1997, and says, on behalf of the United States government, that what was done was deeply, profoundly, morally wrong. Clinton's apology comes 65 years after the study begins, and 25 years after it ends. 8 men from the original 600 are still alive to hear it. Herman Shaw speaks at the event. He says the day is a great one because the damage that was done cannot be undone, but at least the truth is finally out. The financial settlement comes earlier. In 1974, a class action lawsuit results in a $10 million out-of-court settlement. The living men with syphilis each receive $37,500. The heirs of those who died receive smaller amounts. No criminal charges are ever filed against any researcher or official involved in the study. The legal and policy consequences are real, even if the criminal ones are not. Congress passes the National Research Act in 1974 directly in response to Tuskegee. The act requires institutional review boards at any institution receiving federal research funding, meaning any research involving human subjects must now be reviewed and approved by an independent board before it begins. The Belmont Report follows in 1979, establishing the 3 core principles that govern human research ethics in the United States to this day: respect for persons, which means informed consent; beneficence, which means doing good and avoiding harm; and justice, which means distributing the benefits and burdens of research fairly. Both documents exist because of what happened in Macon County. The longer consequence is harder to measure, but documented in research. A 2016 peer-reviewed study by economists Marcella Alsan and Marianne Wanamaker finds a statistically measurable connection between black men's awareness of the Tuskegee study and reduced engagement with the medical system in the years after 1972. In counties with higher proportions of older black men, the demographic most likely to have known someone in the study or to have heard about it directly, there are measurable drops in physician interactions and increases in mortality from causes that medical care could have addressed. The study's effects on medical trust do not end in 1972. They continue for decades. That mistrust surfaces again during the AIDS crisis in the 1980s and again during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 and 2021. Researchers and public health officials document hesitancy toward vaccines and medical interventions among Black Americans at rates that are statistically connected in survey data and in interviews to awareness of Tuskegee. The study does not merely harm the 600 men enrolled in it. It damages the relationship between an entire community and the medical establishment for generations. The last known survivor of the Tuskegee study dies in January 2004. Historians describe it as the longest non-therapeutic experiment on human beings in medical history. Non-therapeutic means the subjects received no medical benefit. They were not being helped. They were being watched for 40 years by their own government. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What makes the next case particularly striking is that the same institutional machinery, the U.S. Public Health Service, the same period, many of the same people, was simultaneously running a nearly identical program on a different group of people it believed had even less power to object. The location was different, the victims were different, but the logic was identical. Case 02. Operation Sea Spray. Biological warfare over San Francisco. San Francisco Bay, September 20th, 1950. A U.S. Navy minesweeper sits anchored just outside the Golden Gate Bridge. It is not there for patrol. It is not there for training. It has hoses and spraying equipment mounted on its deck, pointed toward the city. As the wind moves inland off the water, the ship begins spraying two types of bacteria into the air over the bay. Nobody in San Francisco knows this is happening. The bacteria are Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigii. The military believes both are harmless. That belief is not based on thorough human safety testing. It is based on the assumption that because the bacteria exist naturally in the environment, deliberately spraying them in concentrated clouds over a city of 800,000 people will produce no serious consequences. That assumption turns out to be wrong. The spraying runs from September 20th to September 27th, 1950. 7 days. Monitoring equipment placed at 43 locations across the city and surrounding areas confirms what the Navy's own analysis later states. Nearly every one of the approximately 800,000 residents of San Francisco inhales around 5,000 bacterial particles per minute during the hours the cloud is airborne. The Army's own internal analysis notes that this exposure level falls within the range that would be considered infectious for anthrax. Anthrax is not what is being sprayed, but the comparison is in the Army's own documents because the point of the test is to simulate what a real biological weapons attack on an American coastal city would look like. The people walking to work, dropping children at school, sitting in diners and sleeping in their beds have no idea they are the test subjects. The operation is part of a much larger program. Between 1949 and 1969, the U.S. Army conducts 239 open-air tests involving biological and chemical agents over American cities and populated areas. Operation Sea Spray is one of the earliest and most extensively documented. The broader program is called the Special Operations Division's Vulnerability Testing Program. Its stated purpose is to assess how exposed American cities are to potential Soviet biological weapons attacks. To do that assessment accurately, the military decides it needs to spray actual bacteria over actual cities and measure how far the particles travel and how many people are exposed. The cities are not consulted. The residents are not told. San Francisco is chosen partly because of its geography. The bay and the prevailing winds create conditions that allow the military to model how a biological agent released offshore would move inland and disperse through a dense urban population. It is From a purely logistical standpoint, an ideal test environment. The 800,000 people living in that environment are variables, not victims, as far as the program is concerned. 2 weeks after the spraying ends, 11 patients arrive at Stanford Hospital in San Francisco with serious urinary tract infections. The infections are caused by Serratia marcescens, the exact bacterium the Navy sprayed over the city 2 weeks earlier. Before 1950, Serratia marcescens infections are virtually unknown at Stanford Hospital. The cluster of 11 cases in a 2-week window, all caused by the same organism that had just been aerosolized over the entire city, is not a coincidence the hospital's doctors can easily explain. One of those 11 patients is Edward J. Nevin. He is 75 years old, Irish-American, a retired pipe fitter. He is at Stanford Hospital recovering from a routine prostate surgery that has gone well. He is not critically ill when he arrives. The Serratia marcescens bacteria enter his urinary tract, move into his bloodstream, and attack his heart valves. The condition is called bacterial endocarditis. It is treatable in many cases, but not in his. Edward Nevin dies on November 1, 1950, 32 days after the Navy finishes spraying the city. The Stanford doctors publish a report on the outbreak in the Archives of Internal Medicine, a journal of the American Medical Association. They document the 11 cases and the unusual cluster of the same organism. They do not know about the Navy's operation. No one tells them. The connection between the spraying and the outbreak is not made publicly for more than 2 decades. What happens inside the Navy's own circles after Nevin's death is documented in accounts that emerge decades later. The commander of the Navy's biological laboratory in Oakland convenes a staff meeting. According to accounts that surface during later investigations, he tells those present that the recent test was probably responsible for the death of a man. He then makes clear that anyone who speaks publicly about this will find that the Navy will ensure that person can never find a job anywhere in the United States. Nobody speaks publicly. The experiment and the death remain unknown outside of military and intelligence circles until 1976, when documents began to surface through congressional investigations. In March 1977, the Army discloses the full scope of the open-air testing program to a Senate subcommittee. The hearings reveal that between 1949 and 1969, the Army conducted 239 tests. In 80 of those tests, live bacteria were used. Officials testify that the bacteria were believed to be harmless at the time. The question of whether that belief was adequately tested before spraying it over hundreds of thousands of people is not answered to the satisfaction of anyone listening. Edward Nevin's grandson, also named Edward Nevin, files a lawsuit in federal court in 1981. He argues that the government's negligence in conducting the test caused his grandfather's death. The federal court rules that the government is immune from the lawsuit under the doctrine of discretionary function, meaning that decisions made by government agencies in the course of their official duties, even if those decisions cause harm, cannot be litigated in the same way as private negligence. The family appeals. The case reaches the U.S. Supreme Court. The court declines to overturn the lower court's ruling. The family receives nothing. No government official is charged with any crime in connection with Edward Nevin's death. The broader program revealed in the 1977 Senate hearings extends far beyond San Francisco. In Minnesota and other Midwestern states, the Army sprays zinc cadmium sulfide, a compound later classified as a confirmed carcinogen, over populated areas to test how particles disperse through the atmosphere. The particles are detected over 1,000 miles away in New York. The people living under the spray zones are not told. The Army's position is that the compound was believed safe at the time. In 1966, Army operatives entered the New York City subway system and dropped light bulbs filled with Bacillus subtilis onto the tracks. The bacteria travel through the ventilation system and the movement of trains for miles through the subway network. Millions of New Yorkers who ride the subway that day are exposed. They are not told. In May 1965, bacteria are released at Washington's National Airport and at a Greyhound bus terminal in the same city. More than 130 people who pass through those locations are exposed. Those people then board planes and buses and travel to 39 cities across 7 states, potentially carrying the bacteria with them. None of them know they have been used to test how quickly a biological agent can spread through a transportation network. The scale of the program, when the full Senate testimony is assembled, is difficult to absorb. 239 tests, 80 involving live bacteria. American cities from coast to coast. Decades of operations. Not one member of the public informed. Not one test subject who consented. The scientific and medical community's retrospective assessment of Serratia marcescens is also important context. Before 1950, the bacterium is not considered a significant human pathogen. After the San Francisco spraying, medical literature begins documenting it as an opportunistic pathogen, meaning it does not cause serious illness in healthy people with strong immune systems, but it can cause severe and sometimes fatal infections in people who are elderly, recently post-surgical, immunocompromised, or otherwise vulnerable. Edward Nevin was elderly and post-surgical. He was precisely the type of person most at risk from the organism the Navy chose to spray over his city. Medical experts who examined the case in the years after the 1977 Senate hearings note that Serratia marcescens may have permanently altered the microbial environment of the San Francisco Bay Area. Before 1950, the organism is virtually absent from clinical records in the region. After 1950, it becomes a documented presence. Whether the 1950 spraying is responsible for that shift cannot be proven conclusively. The timing is what it is. The broader question the Senate hearings surface is one that does not have a clean answer. The military's position throughout is that the tests were conducted because the threat of Soviet biological weapons was real, the need to understand American vulnerability was genuine, and the bacteria used were believed at the time to be safe for the general population. None of those statements are fabrications. The Soviet biological weapons program was real. American vulnerability was a legitimate national security concern. The belief that the bacteria were safe was genuinely held. What the hearings also establish, and what no official testimony adequately addresses, is that the belief was not adequately tested before it was acted upon at scale. Spraying an unverified assumption over 800,000 people is not a safety protocol. It is an experiment conducted on a population that did not know it was being experimented on and had no mechanism to refuse. The legal immunity the federal courts extend to the government in the Nevin case means there is no judicial accountability. The Senate hearings produce no criminal referrals. No researcher, no military official, no intelligence officer faces any legal consequence for any of the 239 tests. The program is officially discontinued in 1969 when President Richard Nixon ends the U.S. Offensive Biological Weapons Program by executive order. By that point, the testing has been running for 20 years. What the San Francisco operation shares with the Tuskegee study, which is running simultaneously during this same period, is the same foundational logic: that certain populations can be used as test subjects without their knowledge or consent, Because the research serves a larger institutional goal that the institution has decided outweighs the rights of the individuals involved. In Tuskegee, the population is black sharecroppers in Alabama. In San Francisco, it is an entire city. The scale is different, the logic is the same. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves the logic indoors. Instead of an open city or a rural county, the setting is a network of universities, hospitals, prisons, and safe houses. Instead of bacteria or syphilis, the substance is LSD. And instead of the Public Health Service or the Navy, the agency running the program is the CIA. What it shares with the cases before it is the part that never changes. The people being experimented on do not know it is happening. Case 03, Project MK Ultra, Same Mind Control Program. Washington, D.C., April 13, 1953. Say, Director Alan Dulles formally authorizes a program that will run for 20 years across more than 30 universities, hospitals, prisons, and private facilities in the United States and Canada. It will involve at least 150 documented sub-projects. It will use LSD, barbiturates, mescaline, hypnosis, electroconvulsive therapy, sensory deprivation, psychological torture, and other methods on people who, in the majority of cases, have no idea any of it is happening to them. The program is called MK Ultra. Its stated purpose is to develop techniques for interrogation and mind control that can be used against Soviet operatives. The Cold War is the justification. CIA officials believe the Soviets are ahead in the development of chemical and psychological interrogation methods, and that the United States needs to close that gap. Whether the Soviets were actually ahead is never conclusively established. What is established is what the CIA does in the name of closing that gap. The program is approved by Dulles and run primarily by Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist who heads the CIA's Technical Services Division. Gottlieb is the operational architect of MK Ultra from its beginning. He believes that LSD in particular has potential as an interrogation tool, that it might break down a subject's resistance or make them susceptible to suggestion in ways that conventional interrogation cannot achieve. The theory is never proven. The experiments are conducted anyway, at scale, on people who do not consent. The research does not stay inside CIA facilities. It is deliberately pushed out into civilian institutions. The CIA funds research through front organizations and cutout foundations, so that the universities and hospitals receiving the money do not always know the CIA is the source. At least 30 universities and research institutions are involved. The list includes some of the most prestigious academic medical centers in the country. Researchers at those institutions conduct experiments on their own patients, on prisoners, on mental hospital residents, and on members of the public, often without telling them what is being administered or why. Senator Ted Kennedy, speaking on the Senate floor during the 1977 hearings that exposed the program, states it plainly. The deputy director of the CIA revealed that over 30 universities and institutions were involved in an extensive testing and experimentation program, which included covert drug tests on unwitting citizens at all social levels, high and low, Native Americans and foreign. Several of these tests involved the administration of LSD to unwitting subjects in social situations. Unwitting. That is the word the CIA uses internally for subjects who do not know they are being given drugs. It appears in CIA documents throughout the MK Ultra period. It is bureaucratic language for what is, by any other description, drugging people without their knowledge or consent. The scale of what is documented, and the documentation is incomplete because CIA Director Richard Helms orders the majority of MKUltra files destroyed in 1973, 2 years before the program is exposed, spans every level of American society. Mental patients, prisoners, drug addicts in treatment, hospital patients recovering from unrelated procedures, soldiers, CIA employees who do not know they are being tested, bar patrons, people who respond to advertisements placed by CIA front operations, sex workers hired by the CIA to bring men into apartments and drug them while agents watch through one-way mirrors. That last operation has its own name. It is called Operation Midnight Climax. The CIA runs safe houses in San Francisco and New York, where sex workers are paid to bring men inside. The men are given drinks laced with LSD. CIA operatives observe through one-way mirrors and take detailed notes on the subject's reactions. The men never know what happened to them. The operation runs for years. The CIA official who oversees the San Francisco safe house operation is George Hunter White, a Federal Bureau of Narcotics agent working under contract with the CIA. His own recorded diary entries describe the operation with a casualness that is difficult to read without understanding what it represents. He writes that he was a minor missionary, actually a heretic, but I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, fun, fun. The men being drugged without their consent in those apartments are not having fun. They do not know what is in their drinks. Some experience severe psychological reactions. LSD, in an unsupported, uncontrolled environment, administered without warning to a person who has no idea they have taken it, can produce terror, paranoia, and psychological crisis. The CIA's notes describe these reactions. They continue the operation anyway. At the National Institute of Mental Health Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, 7 black men who are patients at the facility, described in documents as drug addicts, are given LSD every single day for 77 consecutive days. 77 days. The doses are escalated over the course of the experiment. The subjects are not told what they are being given or why. The experiment is funded by the CIA as part of MKUltra. No long-term follow-up study is conducted on what 77 consecutive days of LSD does to a human being. The records of these men's outcomes are not preserved in a way that allows later researchers to track what happened to them. The most documented individual case in MKUltra is Frank Olson. Olson is 43 years old in November 1953. He is a U.S. Army biochemist and the acting chief of the Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick in Maryland, which is the Army's Biological Weapons Research Center. He is working with the CIA on aspects of the MKUltra program related to biological and chemical agents. On November 18, 1953, Olson attends a working retreat at a CIA facility called Deep Creek Lake in western Maryland. Sidney Gottlieb is there. Other CIA and Army personnel are there. On the second evening of the retreat, Gottlieb puts LSD into a bottle of Cointreau liqueur and serves it to the group. He waits 20 minutes before telling them what he has done. Frank Olson is among those dosed. He has never taken LSD before. He does not handle it well. In the days that follow the retreat, colleagues describe him as deeply disturbed, paranoid, and withdrawn. He tells his wife something is wrong. He is taken to New York to see a CIA-connected psychiatrist named Harold Abramson. Abramson is not a licensed psychiatrist for treating LSD reactions. He is a researcher with his own MK Ultra funding. On November 28, 1953, 9 days after being dosed with LSD at Deep Creek Lake, Frank Olson falls from the window of room 1018A at the Statler Hotel in New York City. He is 13 floors up. He dies from the fall. He is 43 years old. His wife and 3 children are not told the true circumstances of what happened. The government tells them he fell from a window during a nervous breakdown. The CIA's involvement, and the fact that he had been secretly drugged 10 days earlier, is not disclosed to his family. The government rules his death a suicide. In 1975, the Rockefeller Commission, a presidential commission investigating CIA domestic activities, includes Frank Olson's case in its findings. The Olson family learns for the first time that Frank had been given LSD without his knowledge. They receive a $750,000 settlement from the government in 1975. They meet with President Gerald Ford and CIA Director William Colby. But the family is not satisfied with the suicide ruling. In 1994, Frank Olson's son Eric has his father's body exhumed. A forensic examination is conducted by James Starrs, a professor of forensic science at George Washington University, and a team of specialists. They find a hematoma, a bruise caused by blunt force trauma, on Olson's skull, on the left side of his head, that is inconsistent with a fall from a window. The injury pattern suggests he was struck on the head before going through the window. The New York Medical Examiner reviews the forensic findings and in 1996 changes the official cause of death from suicide to unknown. A Manhattan district attorney opens a homicide investigation. The investigation is eventually closed without charges due to insufficient evidence to prosecute. The hotel's night manager, who was present on the night of Olson's death, later gives a statement that is recorded in multiple accounts of the case. He says that in all his years in the hotel business, he never encountered a case where someone got up in the middle of the night, ran across a dark room, avoiding 2 beds, and went through a closed window with the shade and curtains drawn. His statement does not prove homicide. It does establish that the physical facts of the scene were strange enough that a professional who had seen many things found them impossible to explain by accident or by straightforward suicide. No CIA official is ever criminally charged in connection with Frank Olson's death. Army Sergeant James Stanley is another documented case with a legal record. Stanley is given LSD without his knowledge while he is a U.S. Army soldier in 1958. He is not told what is happening. He experiences severe psychological effects. His marriage breaks down. His behavior changes in ways he cannot explain because he does not know he has been drugged. He does not learn about the experiment until 1975, when the Army, in the course of disclosures related to the post-MK Ultra investigations, sends him a letter asking him to participate in a follow-up study on the long-term effects of LSD. Stanley sues the U.S. government. His case reaches the Supreme Court. In 1987, the court rules against him in a 5-4 decision, holding that soldiers cannot sue the government for injuries sustained during military service, even if those injuries result from secret, non-consensual drug experiments. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor writes a dissent. She notes that the United States had prosecuted Nazi doctors at the Nuremberg trials for conducting exactly this kind of experiment on unwitting human subjects, and that the least society can do is ensure that victims are compensated. The majority does not find that argument sufficient to change the ruling. Stanley receives nothing. The institutional consequences of MK Ultra's exposure are real, even though the criminal ones are not. The Church Committee hearings in 1977, led by Senator Frank Church, produced the most detailed public record of MK Ultra's scope. CIA Director Stansfield Turner testifies. He acknowledges the program and the destruction of records ordered by Helms in 1973. He states that the agency's own assessment of the LSD tests was that they had little scientific rationale, meaning the experiments that destroyed lives contributed to at least one death and were conducted on unwitting subjects for 20 years, were not even producing useful data. The CIA's own people, reviewing the program from the inside, concluded it had little scientific justification. President Gerald Ford issues an executive order in 1976 prohibiting non-consensual human experimentation by U.S. government agencies. Universities and hospitals that had received CIA funding through front organizations tightened their institutional review processes. Permanent Congressional Intelligence Oversight Committees are established in direct response to the Church Committee findings. The infrastructure of oversight that now exists over U.S. intelligence activities is, in significant part, a consequence of what MKUltra did. None of that oversight existed while the program was running. None of the 150 sub-projects were reviewed by an independent body before they were conducted. None of the unwitting subjects had any mechanism to find out what had been done to them. Most never did find out. The files were destroyed. The records that survived are incomplete. The full number of people affected is not known, and likely never will be. What MKUltra shares with every case before it is the gap, the space between what the institution knows and what the people affected know. In Tuskegee, the men know they are in a study, but not what is being withheld from them. In San Francisco, the population does not know the experiment is happening at all. In MKUltra, the subjects do not know they are subjects. They do not know what is in their drinks, their food, or their medical treatments. They walk out of CIA safe houses and Army retreats and hospital rooms, not knowing their minds have been used as laboratory equipment. Quote _2 __. The next case takes place in a setting where the subjects cannot walk out at all. They are already behind walls, already stripped of most of their rights, already dependent on institutions for everything from food to medical care. What is done to them inside those walls involves not drugs or bacteria, but something that goes to the foundation of what the Manhattan Project was built on. Case 04. The plutonium injections. Manhattan Project Human Experiments. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, April 10, 1945. A 53-year-old black man named Eb Cade is lying in a hospital bed. He was in a car accident at a Manhattan Project construction site where he worked as a cement mixer. He has broken bones in his arm and leg. The breaks are serious, but not life-threatening. He is expected to recover. He does not know that the doctors treating him have been waiting for someone like him. That morning, without telling him what they are doing or why, the doctors inject him with 4.7 micrograms of plutonium. He is assigned a code designation, HP-12. HP stands for Human Product. He is the 12th such product in the program. He is not a patient to the people running this experiment. He is a data point with a pulse. The Manhattan Project is the U.S. government program that builds the atomic bomb. By 1944, it employs over 130 0,000 people across multiple sites and has spent what will eventually total $2 billion. The physicists and engineers building the bomb know that plutonium is dangerous. They know workers are being exposed to it. What they do not know, with any precision, is what plutonium does inside a human body, how it is absorbed, where it deposits, how long it stays, and at what levels it begins to cause fatal damage. Animal studies have been conducted, but the Manhattan Project's medical team concludes in 1944 that animal data is insufficient. They need human data. The decision to begin injecting human subjects is approved by Manhattan Project leadership. 4 senior radiologists design the program. The subjects will be selected from hospital patient populations at project-affiliated institutions across the country. They will be chosen, according to internal documents, partly because they are already ill, isolated, and unlikely to raise questions. None of them will be told what is being injected into them. The program runs at hospitals in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Rochester, New York, Chicago, Illinois, and San Francisco, California. In total, 18 people are injected with plutonium. 6 others are injected with uranium. 5 are injected with polonium. At least 1 receives americium. None of them give informed consent. None of them are told the name of what is entering their bodies. Ebb Cade's case is the first and among the most thoroughly documented. The 4.7 micrograms injected into him is nearly 5 times the amount that the Manhattan Project's own safety standards at the time define as the maximum permissible body burden for a worker with ongoing exposure. Cade is not a radiation worker. He is a patient in a hospital recovering from car accident injuries. He receives nearly 5 times the supposed safe limit in a single injection with no warning and no consent. After the injection, the doctors do not set his broken bones. They wait. They wait 20 days. The reason they wait is documented in internal records. They want to extract bone samples before the fractures heal, so the samples will show plutonium content in fresh bone tissue. The bones are left broken for 20 days, so researchers can get better data. When the bones are finally set, the doctors pull 15 of Cade's teeth and ship them to Wright Langham at Los Alamos National Laboratory for plutonium content analysis. The teeth are sent to a weapons laboratory for analysis. The man they came from is not told why his teeth have been removed. At some point during his hospital stay, Cade apparently concludes that something is being done to him that is not being explained. One morning, a nurse opens the door to his room and finds he is gone. He has left during the night without being discharged. He is never formally followed up with by the program. He dies of heart failure in 1953, 8 years after the injection. Whether the plutonium contributed to his death is not established in any documented medical record because the program made no real effort to track his long-term health after he walked out. The second case is Albert Stevens, a 58-year-old house painter in San Francisco. Stevens is brought to the University of California Hospital in San Francisco in May 1945. He has a stomach mass that doctors diagnose as terminal stomach cancer. On the basis of that diagnosis, the decision is made to inject him with plutonium as part of the Manhattan Project Human Experiments program. He receives a combination of 2 plutonium isotopes, Pu-238 and Pu-239. The total activity of what is injected into him gives him what researchers later calculate is the highest radiation dose any human being is known to have received and survived. The diagnosis is wrong. Stevens does not have stomach cancer. He has a stomach ulcer. The surgery to treat what doctors thought was cancer removes the ulcer successfully. Stevens recovers. He lives for another 20 years, carrying the plutonium in his body the entire time. The researchers running the program realize Stevens is going to live far longer than they anticipated. He becomes one of their most valuable ongoing data sources. When Stevens later considers relocating away from the San Francisco area, the laboratory offers him a financial stipend to stay. He accepts. He continues to provide biological samples, urine, feces, for analysis for years. He provides them not knowing what he was injected with or why his samples are being collected. He is never told the truth. He dies in 1966, still not knowing. His effective full-body radiation dose from the experiment is later calculated at 64 sieverts, a figure that, for context, means a dose of 4 to 5 sieverts is considered potentially fatal for a healthy adult. Stevens carries more than 12 times that amount for 2 decades. The third case involves a child. Simeon Shaw is 4 years old. He is Australian. His parents bring him to the United States in 1946, seeking treatment for bone cancer at the University of California. In April 1946, Simeon is injected with plutonium and other radioisotopes at the University of California facility as part of the Manhattan Project experiments. His parents are told the injections are part of his cancer treatment. They are not told the injections contain plutonium. They are not told their son is a research subject in a government weapons program. Simeon deteriorates. His parents bring him back to Australia, where he dies. He is still 4 years old when he dies. His parents spend the following years believing his death was the result of his cancer progressing despite treatment. It is 30 years before his family learns what was actually injected into their son. The institutional record of what the people running this program knew and thought about it is preserved in documents that surface decades later through the work of investigative journalist Eileen Wellsome and the subsequent government declassification program initiated in the early 1990s. An Internal Atomic Energy Commission memorandum from April 1947, 2 years after the injections begin, directly addresses the question of public disclosure. The memo recommends that the experiments not be made public because, in its own language, it might have an adverse effect on public opinion or result in legal suits. The people running the program are not debating whether what they did was ethical. They are managing the risk of being found out. The concern is not the subjects. The concern is the lawsuits. The AEC is created in 1946 to take over from the Manhattan Project the oversight of U.S. nuclear weapons and atomic energy programs. It inherits the human experiments along with everything else. By 1947, its officials know enough about what happened to be worried about public reaction. They choose concealment. The experiments are not publicly known for nearly 50 years. Eileen Wellsome is a reporter at the Albuquerque Tribune. In the late 1980s, she begins investigating references she finds in declassified documents to human plutonium experiments. She spends years tracking down the identities of the subjects, who in the original research documents are referred to only by code designations. She finds their names. She finds their families. She publishes her findings in a 3-part series in the Albuquerque Tribune in November 1993. The series wins the Pulitzer Prize. Her reporting triggers an immediate government response. Energy Secretary Hazel O'Leary launches a declassification initiative that ultimately releases thousands of pages of previously secret documents on human radiation experiments conducted during the Cold War era. President Clinton establishes the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments in January 1994 to review the full scope of what the documents reveal. The Advisory Committee's final report, released in 1995, covers not just the plutonium injections, but the broader landscape of radiation experiments conducted on American citizens from the 1940s through the 1970s. Its conclusion regarding the plutonium injections is unambiguous. In no case, the report states, was there any expectation that these patient subjects would benefit medically from the injections. They were not being treated. They were being used. The government's financial response to the plutonium injection cases is partial. Settlements totaling $4.8 million are eventually paid to 12 of the 18 plutonium subjects or their families. Records covering the remaining 6 subjects are incomplete enough that their cases cannot be fully resolved through the compensation process. Some of those subjects or their families receive nothing. The legal framework that allows this outcome is the same one that shields the government in the San Francisco biological weapons case. Federal sovereign immunity and the discretionary function doctrine limit what injured parties can recover through the courts. The compensation that does occur comes through administrative processes, not through judicial findings of liability. No researcher involved in the plutonium injection program is ever criminally charged. The Congressional Subcommittee report, published in 1986, titled American Nuclear Guinea Pigs: 3 Decades of Radiation Experiments on U.S. Citizens, documents the broader pattern of which the plutonium injections are one part. The report covers experiments conducted at multiple institutions across 3 decades. Its title is not rhetorical. It is a description of what the documents show. What the plutonium injection program shares with the cases before it is the selection logic. The subjects are chosen because they are vulnerable in specific ways. Ebb Cade is black, a manual laborer, far from home, injured, and dependent on the hospital treating him. Albert Stevens is a working-class man with what his doctors tell him is a terminal diagnosis, meaning he has been told he is already dying and has no future to protect. Simeon Shaw is 4 years old and in a foreign country. The subjects in Rochester and Chicago include patients selected from hospital populations on the basis of their isolation and their unlikelihood to raise questions. The program does not target powerful people. It targets people who the institution calculates will not be able to fight back, will not be believed if they complain, or will not live long enough to matter. That calculation is documented in the selection criteria the researchers use. It is not an inference. It is in the records. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What comes next shares the same geography, the same network of government agencies, university hospitals, and Cold War institutional logic, but moves the focus to a different category of harm. The next case does not involve radioactive material. It involves children who cannot speak for themselves, parents who are told one thing while another thing entirely is being done, and an institution so overcrowded and so neglected that the researchers running experiments inside it argue the conditions they created were actually an improvement on what already existed. Case 05. The Guatemala Syphilis Experiments. Guatemala City, Guatemala, 1946. The Nuremberg doctors' trial begins in December of that year. 23 German physicians are in the dock for conducting medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners without their consent. The charges include subjecting human beings to diseases they did not have, infecting wounds deliberately, and performing procedures that caused death. The trial will last until August 1947. The verdicts will establish what becomes known as the Nuremberg Code, the foundational international standard for ethical human experimentation, built on the principle that voluntary consent is absolutely essential. While that trial is running, a U.S. Public Health Service physician named John Charles Cutler is in Guatemala doing the same thing. Not something similar, the same thing. Deliberately infecting human beings with syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroid without their knowledge or consent in a program funded by the U.S. National Institutes of Health and conducted in partnership with the Pan American Sanitary Bureau and the Guatemalan government. The subjects include prisoners, psychiatric patients, soldiers, sex workers, orphaned children, and indigenous Guatemalans. The youngest are children. The most vulnerable are locked inside institutions they cannot leave. The experiments run from 1946 to 1948, with serological follow-up studies continuing until 1953. In that period, at least 1,308 people are deliberately infected with sexually transmitted diseases. Approximately 700 of them receive any treatment afterward. 83 deaths are documented in the records by the end of 1953. Whether all of those deaths are directly caused by the experiments is not fully established. What is established is that 83 people who were enrolled in the study are dead by 1953, and that the majority of the 308 who were infected received inadequate or no treatment for what was deliberately put into their bodies. The program does not happen by accident, and it does not happen in Guatemala by coincidence. John Cutler comes to Guatemala directly from a predecessor program run by the U.S. Public Health Service at a federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana in 1943 and 1944. The Terre Haute program deliberately infects American prisoners with gonorrhea to test whether chemical compounds can prevent infection after exposure. The program struggles to achieve consistent infection rates in Indiana. The researchers also find themselves constrained by the ethical and legal environment on American soil, the difficulty of operating a program involving deliberate infection of prisoners without generating scrutiny or legal consequences. The solution they settle on is to move the program to another country. Guatemala is chosen because the researchers believe they will face fewer ethical constraints, less legal risk, and less public scrutiny there than in the United States. This is not an inference drawn from the circumstances. The Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues, which reviews the full documentary record in 2011, states explicitly that researchers moved the program overseas specifically to avoid the ethical constraints related to individual consent, other adverse legal consequences, and bad publicity. They go to Guatemala because they know what they are doing is wrong, and they want to do it somewhere they cannot be held accountable for it. Cutler establishes the program at 4 institutions in Guatemala City: the National Prison, the National Psychiatric Hospital, Army Barracks, and a national orphanage. The choice of institutions is not random. Every one of them contains a population with severely limited ability to refuse participation, seek outside help, or communicate what is being done to them. Prisoners are under state control. Psychiatric patients are institutionalized and can be dismissed as unreliable. Soldiers operate within a chain of command. Children in an orphanage have no parents present to advocate for them. The methods Cutler uses to infect subjects go significantly beyond what the earlier Terre Haute program attempted. The initial approach uses sex workers who are already infected with syphilis. Cutler pays them to have intercourse with male prisoners. When the transmission rates from this method are inconsistent, not every act of intercourse results in infection, Cutler moves to direct inoculation. He and his team scrape the skin of subjects and apply infectious syphilis bacteria directly to the open wounds, holding the material against the abraded flesh for 1 to 2 hours. They also inject syphilis bacteria mixed with beef heart broth, distilled water, or human spinal fluid directly onto and into the bodies of subjects. The psychiatric hospital provides the most extreme documented cases. Berta is a female psychiatric patient at the National Psychiatric Hospital. Her last name does not appear in the documents that survive. In February 1948, Cutler's team injects her with syphilis. She subsequently develops scabies. 1 month later, in March 1948, Cutler personally inserts gonorrheal pus into both of her eyes, her urethra, and her rectum. He then reinfects her with syphilis. Within days, her eyes are filled with pus, and she is bleeding from her urethra. Cutler's own notes record the progression. On August 27, 1948, his notes record that she appeared as if she was going to die. She dies shortly after. His notes do not record a clear cause of death. No autopsy findings for Berta appear in the documents that survive. She is a psychiatric patient in a locked institution in 1948. She cannot leave. She cannot refuse. She cannot tell anyone outside the institution what is being done to her. She has no name in history beyond a first name in a researcher's notes. Cutler's records show awareness throughout that what he is doing cannot withstand outside scrutiny. He deliberately withholds information from the Pan American Sanitary Bureau about the methods being used. He keeps key details out of his official reports. The results of the study are never published in any medical journal. Cutler knows that publishing them would require describing the methods, and describing the methods would make clear that the program violates every standard of medical ethics that exists at the time, including the standards being formally codified at Nuremberg while he is running the program. The study ends in 1948. The follow-up serological work continues until 1953. After that, the files go into storage. Cutler goes on to other work. He later becomes one of the lead researchers on the Tuskegee syphilis study in Alabama, which runs simultaneously with the Guatemala program and continues until 1972. The same man, the same institution, the same logic applied to different populations on different continents for 3 decades. The files from Guatemala go into storage at the University of Pittsburgh, where Cutler eventually deposits his personal papers. They sit there for more than 60 years. Susan Reverby is a historian at Wellesley College. In 2009, she is conducting archival research on the Tuskegee study when she comes across Cutler's personal files at the University of Pittsburgh. Inside those files, she finds the documentation of the Guatemala experiments. She finds Cutler's notes. She finds the records of the infections, the methods, the case histories. She finds Berta's case. She finds the documentation of the children at the orphanage. She finds the 83 deaths. Reverby does not immediately publish what she has found. She spends time verifying the documents and consulting with other scholars and with officials at the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues. She publishes her findings in the Journal of Policy History in 2010. The U.S. government's response is immediate. On October 1, 2010, President Barack Obama personally telephones Guatemalan President Álvaro Colom to apologize. It is a head-of-state-to-head-of-state apology for what one country's government did to another country's citizens more than 60 years earlier. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Department of Health and Human Services Secretary Kathleen Sebelius issue a joint statement calling the experiments clearly unethical. President Colom calls them publicly a crime against humanity. The Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues publishes its full report in 2011 under the title Ethically Impossible. The title comes from a phrase that appears in the documents themselves. Cutler's own records contain language acknowledging that certain aspects of the program would be considered ethically impossible to conduct in the United States. He uses the phrase to explain why the program is in Guatemala. The Commission takes the phrase as its title because no other phrase more precisely captures what the documents show. That the researchers knew, in their own words, that what they were doing could not be done ethically, and they did it anyway. The Commission's conclusion regarding the institutional record is direct. It states that it is clear from the language of the reports that U.S. researchers understood the profoundly unethical nature of the study. This is not a conclusion that the researchers were ignorant of ethical standards. It is a conclusion that they understood those standards and chose to violate them deliberately, offshore, on a population they calculated could not hold them accountable. The legal consequences for victims are non-existent. A lawsuit filed on behalf of Guatemalan victims and their descendants makes its way through the U.S. federal court system for years. In 2012, a federal district court dismisses the case, ruling that the U.S. government cannot be sued for actions taken in a foreign country. The plaintiffs appeal. In 2021, a federal appeals court reinstates part of the case against private defendants, including Johns Hopkins University, the Rockefeller Foundation, and Bristol-Myers Squibb, whose predecessor company supplied some of the materials used in the experiments. In January 2024, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals dismisses the final remaining claims. No compensation is ever paid to any victim or any victim's family by any party, government, or private. The people who were infected, who were blinded with gonorrheal pus, who died in a psychiatric hospital in Guatemala City, received nothing. Their names, in most cases, are not in any record. The documentation that survives is the documentation Cutler kept for scientific purposes. There is no parallel record of the victims as people, their lives before the experiments, their families, what happened to the ones who survived. What the Guatemala experiments add to the institutional record established by the earlier cases is the element of deliberate geographic evasion. The researchers in Tuskegee operate on American soil, but target a population they calculate has no meaningful recourse. The researchers in San Francisco operate covertly, so the population does not know an experiment is happening. The researchers in Guatemala go to another country specifically because they know what they are planning cannot survive legal or ethical scrutiny in the United States. The progression across these cases is not accidental. It is an institution learning, over time, how to conduct experiments it cannot defend by placing them somewhere defense is less likely to be required. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes place not in another country, or in a covert operation, or in a rural Alabama county. It takes place on Staten Island, New York, inside a state institution that a sitting U.S. Senator describes as a snake pit. where thousands of children with intellectual disabilities are warehoused in conditions that the researchers running experiments inside it will later argue, with a straight face, actually represent an improvement on the baseline. Case 06. The Willowbrook Hepatitis Experiments. Staten Island, New York, 1956. Willowbrook State School opens in 1947. It is built to house children with intellectual disabilities. The designed capacity is 4,000. By the mid-1960s, it holds over 6,000. The gap between those two numbers is not an administrative footnote. It is the physical reality that every child, every staff member, and every parent who walks through the doors lives inside. The buildings are overcrowded. The toilets overflow. Children are left in their own waste for hours. Clothing is shared between residents because there is not enough for each child to have their own. Staff ratios are so low that supervision of basic hygiene is impossible across entire wings of the facility. Children who arrive at Willowbrook without hepatitis contract it within the first year at a documented rate of approximately 50%. The virus spreads through fecal-oral contact, and in a facility where sanitation has collapsed under the weight of overcrowding, transmission is effectively built into the environment. In 1965, Senator Robert F. Kennedy tours Willowbrook. He describes what he sees publicly. He calls it a snake pit. He says residents are living in filth and dirt, their clothing in rags, in rooms less comfortable and cheerful than the cages in which we put animals in a zoo. His statement is not disputed by the state. The conditions he describes are not temporary. They are the baseline that has existed for years and will continue to exist for years after his visit. This is the institution that New York University physician Dr. Saul Krugman chooses in 1956 to begin a program of deliberate hepatitis infection experiments on the children living there. The program runs for 16 years. Krugman's stated scientific goal is to study hepatitis, specifically to understand the difference between what is then called infectious hepatitis and serum hepatitis, which are later identified as hepatitis A and hepatitis B, respectively. This is a legitimate scientific question. Hepatitis is a serious public health problem in the 1950s, and the mechanisms of the two strains are not well understood. Understanding them could eventually lead to vaccines and treatments that would help many people. The method Krugman chooses to pursue that goal is to deliberately infect the children at Willowbrook with the hepatitis virus and observe what happens to them. The primary method of exposure in the early phase of the study involves hepatitis-infected fecal matter from other residents of Willowbrook. The material is combined with chocolate milk and fed to the research participants. The children drink it. They do not know what is in it. They are not told. They are between the ages of approximately 3 and 11. Some of them have intellectual disabilities severe enough that they could not have understood an explanation even if one had been given. The U.S. Army funds the research. The New York State Department of Mental Hygiene approves it. New York University provides the institutional backing. The 3 layers of approval, federal funding, state authorization, and university endorsement, give the program a structure of legitimacy that makes it, on paper, an approved scientific enterprise. That structure of approval does not change what is being done to the children inside the building. The consent process Krugman uses is where the institutional record becomes particularly difficult to read. Between 1963 and 1966, the main residential buildings at Willowbrook are closed to new admissions. The school is full. Parents who apply for placement for their children are told there is no space. But a separate letter is sent to those same parents, informing them that space remains available in the hepatitis research unit for children whose parents consent to their participation in the study. The research unit has better conditions than the general population. It is newer. It is less crowded. It has more staff. Parents who want their child admitted to Willowbrook and who are told the general population is full are offered admission specifically in the unit where their child will be deliberately infected with hepatitis. The consent forms they are asked to sign describe what Krugman calls vaccinations. The forms do not use the word hepatitis in a way that makes clear the child will be intentionally infected. Parents who do not read medical literature carefully, who are exhausted by years of caring for a child with significant intellectual disabilities, who have been told there is nowhere else for their child to go, sign the forms. Bioethicist Arthur Kaplan later describes the consent structure at Willowbrook as coercive in the clearest possible sense. The parents are not being asked to make a free choice. They are being presented with a situation in which the only path to care for their child runs through consent to an experiment. That is not consent. It is leverage. Henry Beecher is a physician at Harvard Medical School. In 1966, he publishes an article in the New England Journal of Medicine titled Ethics and Clinical Research. The article lists 22 examples of medical research being conducted in the United States that Beecher considers ethically indefensible. He does not name the researchers. He describes the experiments. Example 16 on his list is the Willowbrook hepatitis study. The article is one of the most consequential publications in the history of American medical ethics. It forces the medical establishment to confront publicly, for the first time in a major peer-reviewed journal, the fact that serious ethical violations in human research are not isolated incidents, but a documented pattern. Beecher's article does not stop the Willowbrook experiments. They continue for another 5 years. Krugman defends the program on 2 grounds throughout. The first is that the children at Willowbrook are going to contract hepatitis anyway. The 50% first-year infection rate in the general population means, he argues, that deliberate infection in a controlled research setting is not meaningfully different from the natural exposure the children face. The second is that the research produces real scientific knowledge. Krugman and his team do make genuine contributions to the understanding of hepatitis A and hepatitis B as distinct conditions, and that work contributes to the eventual development of the hepatitis B vaccine. Both arguments are heard, and both are contested. The response to the first argument is the one that matters most. The fact that a child will likely be exposed to harm through institutional negligence does not give researchers the right to deliberately inflict that harm earlier and under controlled conditions. The 50% natural infection rate at Willowbrook is not a natural baseline. It is a consequence of the state's failure to maintain sanitary conditions in a facility it operates. Using that failure as justification for deliberate infection compounds one wrong with another. If the conditions at Willowbrook were the problem, the solution was to fix the conditions, not to use them as cover for experiments. Vaccinologist Maurice Hilleman, one of the most accomplished vaccine developers in American history, later states that the Willowbrook experiments are the most unethical medical experiments ever performed on children in the United States. His statement comes from inside the medical establishment, not from outside critics. It reflects a professional judgment about what was done, not a lay reaction to it. The program ends in 1971. The mechanism of its ending is not a regulatory decision or a legal ruling. It is a television broadcast. Geraldo Rivera is a young journalist working at WABC-TV in New York. In early 1972, he obtains access to Willowbrook and films what he finds inside. The footage he broadcasts on January 6, 1972, shows residents lying on bare floors, unclothed, in their own waste. It shows children rocking alone in corners with no staff present. It shows what the institution actually looks like behind its administrative reports and its research publications. The broadcast reaches a national audience. The public reaction is immediate and overwhelming. Rivera's broadcast does not specifically focus on the hepatitis experiments. It focuses on the general conditions at the facility. But the attention it brings to Willowbrook creates the political environment in which the experiments become impossible to continue defending. John Lennon and Yoko Ono hold a benefit concert at Madison Square Garden in August 1972 to raise money for Willowbrook residents. The story stays in public consciousness. In March 1972, the New York Civil Liberties Union and the Legal Aid Society file a class action lawsuit on behalf of Willowbrook parents. The lawsuit argues that residents have a constitutional right to protection from harm and to minimally adequate treatment. In 1975, a consent decree is reached requiring New York State to reduce the population at Willowbrook and to develop community-based placements for residents. The decree establishes legally enforceable standards for the care of people with intellectual disabilities in New York State institutions. It is one of the earliest legal documents in the United States to establish that institutionalized people with disabilities have enforceable rights. Willowbrook closes in 1987. It takes 15 years from the Rivera broadcast to actually shut the facility down. Saul Krugman's professional fate is worth recording precisely because it illustrates the gap between what the medical establishment says about ethics and what it does with the people who violate them. In 1972, the same year the Willowbrook experiments end, and the same year Rivera's broadcast generates national outrage, Krugman is elected president of the American Pediatric Society. He receives the Robert Koch Gold Medal in 1978. He receives the John Howland Award in 1981. He receives the Mary Woodard Lasker Public Service Award in 1983. He is never prosecuted. He is never formally sanctioned by any medical licensing body. He dies in 1994, having received some of the highest honors the American medical establishment offers. The children he infected with hepatitis received no compensation. No legal process is ever established to identify them individually or to assess what the experiments cost them. The consent decree that comes out of the 1972 lawsuit addresses conditions at the facility but does not create a compensation mechanism for the research subjects specifically. The Army funding that supported the program for years generates no liability finding. New York University generates no liability finding. The state of New York, which approved the experiments and ran the facility where they took place, is not held financially accountable to the children who were used. What Willowbrook adds to the record already established by the earlier cases is the element of institutional layering. Tuskegee operates within the structure of the U.S. Public Health Service. The San Francisco biological tests operate within the military. The plutonium injections operate within the Manhattan Project and the AEC. Guatemala operates through the USPHS in a foreign country. In each of those cases, there is a single institutional chain running the program. Willowbrook operates through 4 overlapping layers simultaneously: federal funding, state authorization, university backing, and a prestigious researcher with professional cover. Each layer provides the others with a degree of insulation. When accountability comes, the layers absorb it. Nobody at the top of any of the 4 chains faces meaningful consequence. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case operates on an even larger institutional canvas. It does not take place in a single facility or a single city. It takes place across an entire prison system in one of the largest cities in the United States, inside a program so extensive that the researcher running it describes his first view of the available subjects the way a farmer describes seeing a fertile field. Case 07. The Holmesburg Prison Experiments. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 1951. Albert Kligman is a dermatologist at the University of Pennsylvania. In the spring of 1951, he is given access to Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia to examine an outbreak of athlete's foot among the inmate population. He walks through the facility. He looks at the men housed there. He later describes what goes through his mind when he first sees the prison population in his own recorded words. "All I saw before me were acres of skin. It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time." He is not talking about crops. He is talking about human beings in a locked facility who cannot leave, who have severely limited legal protections, and who are available to him in large numbers for as long as he wants to use them. Kligman returns to Holmesburg. He does not return to treat the athlete's foot outbreak. He returns to begin one of the most extensive human experimentation programs ever run inside a single institution in the United States. He will work there for 23 years. Holmesburg Prison opens in 1896. By the 1950s, it is a working detention facility in Philadelphia, housing men awaiting trial and serving shorter sentences. The population is predominantly African American. The men inside have access to almost no resources, no money, no outside advocates in most cases, no legal representation for anything beyond their criminal cases, and no way to refuse the attention of a University of Pennsylvania physician who arrives with the backing of the institution, the university, and eventually the U.S. Army and the CIA. Kligman's initial experiments are dermatological. He tests skin creams, lotions, antifungal compounds, and cosmetic products on the inmates. The pharmaceutical and cosmetic industries pay for access to the prison population. The men are paid small amounts, a few dollars, for participation. In a facility where there is nothing to do and no money, a few dollars is not nothing. But payment in a coercive environment does not produce free consent. A man in a prison cell who is offered money by the physician who has institutional authority over his medical care is not in the same position as a free person choosing whether to enroll in a study. The dermatological work expands quickly. Within a few years, Kligman is testing not just skin products, but radioactive isotopes applied directly to skin. He is testing psychotropic drugs. He is testing dioxin, the toxic chemical compound that is a byproduct of the herbicide manufacturing process and becomes infamous as the primary toxic component of Agent Orange, the defoliant used by the U.S. military in Vietnam. The dioxin testing is done under contract with Dow Chemical, which manufactures the herbicide and wants to understand the compound's effects on human skin and tissue. The dioxin experiments are among the most thoroughly documented in terms of long-term harm to participants. Kligman applies dioxin directly to the skin of prisoners and injects it into their bodies. Dioxin causes chloracne, a severe and persistent skin condition involving deep cysts and lesions that can be permanent. Survivors of the Holmesburg dioxin experiments report severe skin lesions, internal health problems, and long-term consequences that track what is known about dioxin toxicity from other exposure studies. The men are not told they are being exposed to a compound that will later be classified as a human carcinogen and that is toxic at extremely low doses. Alan Hornblum is a literacy instructor who begins working at Holmesburg Prison in 1971, 20 years after Kligman first walks through the doors. Hornblum is not a researcher and not a medical professional. He is there to teach. What he observes is not a research protocol. It is a physical reality that is impossible to miss. He later writes that many inmates at Holmesburg had patches or gauze pads on their backs, which were the result of long time and extensive human experiments. The men he is teaching have visible evidence of ongoing experiments on their bodies. This is not a secret inside the prison. It is simply accepted as part of what Holmesburg is. Hornblum spends years after leaving the prison researching what happened there. His 1998 book, Acres of Skin, is the most comprehensive account of the Holmesburg experiments and takes its title directly from Kligman's own words. The research Hornblum conducts involves tracking down survivors, reviewing documents, and interviewing former inmates and staff. What he documents goes significantly beyond what was publicly known before his work. The CIA's involvement at Holmesburg runs through the MK-Ultra program that is operating simultaneously during this period. Kligman conducts experiments on prisoners under CIA contract, testing mind-altering substances, including compounds being evaluated for their potential use in interrogation. The prisoners being given these substances are not told they are part of a CIA program. They are not told what the compounds are. They are told they are participating in a medical study. The CIA's interest in Holmesburg is the same as its interest in the safe houses in San Francisco and New York, a captive population that cannot easily report what is being done to them and has no institutional advocate to raise alarms. The U.S. Army's contracts with Kligman cover a range of testing, including the dioxin work and experiments involving other chemical compounds the Army is interested in for weapons-related applications. The Army wants human data on how certain compounds affect tissue, how they spread through the body, and at what doses they produce specific effects. Holmesburg provides a population on which to get that data. The contracts are documented in Army records that surface through later investigations. Johnson & Johnson, Dow Chemical, and other private corporations pay for access to the prison population for product testing. The arrangement is straightforward from a business perspective. Testing products on a captive, available population is faster and cheaper than running community trials with free volunteers. The prison provides bodies. The corporations provide money. Kligman sits in the middle and runs the program. The University of Pennsylvania provides the institutional credibility that makes the arrangement look like legitimate research. A UCSF internal investigation conducted years later finds that experiments at Holmesburg included putting pesticides and herbicides on the men's skin and injecting them into their veins. The investigation also finds that in many cases, there is no record of any informed consent process. Not inadequate consent, no record of consent at all. Kligman develops two products during his years at Holmesburg that become some of the most commercially successful dermatological treatments in history. Retin-A, a topical retinoid used to treat acne and later adopted widely as an anti-aging skin treatment, is developed from research conducted during the prison experiments. Renova, a related product, follows. Both become multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical products. The men whose skin Kligman used to develop and refine these treatments receive nothing from their commercial success. They are not acknowledged in the product's development histories. They are not compensated when the products go to market. The legal record for Holmesburg survivors is largely one of failure. Lawsuits filed by former inmates are dismissed in the majority of cases. The statute of limitations is a primary barrier. Many survivors do not learn the full scope of what was done to them until Hornblum's research brings it to public attention in the late 1990s, by which point the legal window for many claims has closed. The University of Pennsylvania does not establish a compensation program. Dow Chemical does not establish a compensation program. The U.S. Army does not establish a compensation program. The CIA does not establish a compensation program. In 2000, the Philadelphia City Council holds hearings on the Holmesburg experiments. Survivors testify. Some of them are in their 60s and 70s by this point, still carrying the physical consequences of what was done to them decades earlier. Their testimony is recorded. The city expresses regret. No compensation follows. Kligman retires from the University of Pennsylvania and continues to receive professional recognition within the dermatology field for his contributions to the science of skin disease. The contributions are real. His research, regardless of how it was conducted, produces clinical knowledge that advances dermatology. That fact does not change what he did to produce it. He is never criminally charged. He is never formally sanctioned by a medical licensing body. He dies in 2010. The University of Pennsylvania has a research chair named after him at the time of his death, though it is later renamed following renewed public attention to the Holmesburg record. What the Holmesburg case makes visible that the earlier cases do not is the full ecosystem of institutional actors who benefit from non-consensual human experimentation. In Tuskegee, the institution is primarily the USPHS, pursuing its own research agenda. In Guatemala, it is the USPHS operating through foreign partners. At Willowbrook, the layers include the Army, the state, and NYU. At Holmesburg, the ecosystem includes a major research university, the U.S. Army, the CIA, and multiple Fortune 500 corporations, all simultaneously drawing value from the same population of imprisoned men. Each actor in that ecosystem has its own justification. The university says it is advancing medical knowledge. The Army says it is addressing national security requirements. The CIA says it is closing the gap with Soviet capabilities. The corporations say they are developing products that will benefit consumers. None of those justifications are invented. All of them are real motivations held by real institutions. What they share is the decision that those motivations outweigh the rights of the men whose bodies are the raw material for all of it. __quote_6___. The next case moves the raw material from adult prisoners to children who have not been convicted of anything. They are not in a prison. They are in a state school in Massachusetts. They are there because they have intellectual disabilities, and their families, in many cases, have no other options. What they are given for breakfast one morning contains something their parents are not told about, something the U.S. government's own atomic energy program provides, and something that a major American food corporation pays to have put there. Case 08. Radioactive oatmeal fed to children. Mitt/Fernald School, Waltham, Massachusetts, late 1940s. The Walter E. Fernald State School sits on a large campus in Waltham, just outside Boston. It is one of the oldest institutions for people with intellectual disabilities in the United States, established in 1848. By the late 1940s, it houses several hundred children and young adults, the majority of them boys. Many have been abandoned by their families. Some have intellectual disabilities significant enough that they require full-time institutional care. Others are there for reasons that have nothing to do with any genuine cognitive impairment. They are poor or orphaned, or were committed by families who could not or would not care for them. Once inside Fernald, they are entirely dependent on the institution for everything: food, clothing, shelter, medical care, education, and any social contact they have with the outside world all come through the facility. These are the children that researchers from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology choose as their subjects. The experiment is nutritional in its framing. MIT researchers want to study how the human body absorbs iron and calcium from food. Specifically, whether the nutrients in oatmeal are absorbed effectively or whether they are blocked by other compounds in the food. This is a real scientific question with real practical applications. Understanding nutrient absorption could help address dietary deficiencies in children, which is a genuine public health concern in the post-war period. The science behind the question is legitimate. The method the researchers choose to answer it is to add radioactive tracers to the oatmeal served to the children, and then measure how the radioactive iron and calcium move through their bodies. The tracers allow researchers to track exactly where the nutrients go, how quickly they are absorbed, and in what quantities. The technique is used in nutritional research during this period. What makes the Fernald case different from standard tracer studies is not the science. It is who the subjects are, what they are told, and why they are chosen. The children are not told the oatmeal contains radioactive material. Their parents or guardians are not told either, at least not in any meaningful way. The letters sent to parents describe something quite different from what is actually happening. The letters invite boys to join a science club. The science club is described as a special opportunity. Members will receive extra food. They will get to go on trips, including to baseball games. They will have access to privileges not available to the general population of the school. The word radioactive does not appear in the letters. The nature of the tracers being added to the food is not disclosed. Parents who receive these letters and sign the permission forms have no basis on which to understand that their sons are being enrolled in a radiation study funded in part by the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission. The AEC provides the radioisotopes used in the study. Quaker Oats, the food company, provides funding for the research. Quaker Oats has a commercial interest in the outcome. If the study demonstrates that the nutrients in oatmeal are effectively absorbed by the body, that finding can be used in marketing. The company that makes the oats is paying for a study that uses radioactive tracers in children's food to generate data it can use to sell more oats. The children eating the oatmeal are not told any of this. MIT conducts an internal review of the experiments decades later when the story becomes public. The review acknowledges that the consent process was inadequate by any standard. That is the language MIT uses. Inadequate by any standard. The consent letters did not disclose the radioactive nature of the study. The parents who signed them could not have been giving informed consent to something they were not informed about. The review does not dispute this. It confirms it. The choice of the Fernald School as the location for the study is not incidental. It is deliberate. The children at Fernald are chosen specifically because of their circumstances. They are institutionalized. They have no family advocates present in their daily lives. They have no access to outside information about their rights or about what is being done to them. They cannot easily communicate concerns to people outside the facility, even if they wanted to. One investigator who reviews the case later states that the Fernald population was specifically chosen because they were least likely to raise objections or seek outside help. That is the selection criterion. Not scientific suitability, not proximity, not demographics that match a target population. Least likely to raise objections. The researchers know they are choosing subjects based on their inability to resist. The science club framing is worth sitting with for a moment. The boys at Fernald are institutionalized. Most of them have extremely limited social lives. They eat institutional food, live in institutional housing, and have very little access to the kinds of ordinary experiences that children outside take for granted. Being offered special food, trips to baseball games, and membership in something called a science club is not a neutral offer to children in that situation. It is an offer that carries real weight precisely because their baseline is so impoverished. The researchers are not offering something small. They are offering something these boys actively want in exchange for participation in a study the boys do not understand. The experiment is not a single event. It runs across multiple studies in the late 1940s and into the early 1950s. Different groups of boys participate in different phases. The doses of radioactive material involved are described by the researchers themselves as low. This is a factual claim that subsequent reviews broadly accept. The radiation doses delivered through the oatmeal are not at the high end of what radiation exposure can involve. They are in a range that most researchers who later review the studies describe as unlikely to cause acute radiation sickness or dramatically elevated cancer risk. But the dose question, while real, is separate from the consent question. Whether the amount of radioactive material was medically significant is a different issue from whether the children and their families had the right to know it was there and to choose whether to participate. Those are two different questions, and the answer to the first does not settle the answer to the second. The MIT review and the subsequent legal proceedings focus on the consent failure, not primarily on the dose levels, because the consent failure is the part that is unambiguous. The experiments remain unknown outside of the research community for decades. The story becomes public in 1993 when it surfaces as part of the broader wave of disclosures about U.S. government radiation experiments that follows Eileen Wellsom's reporting on the plutonium injections and Energy Secretary Hazel O'Leary's declassification initiative. The Fernald experiments are among the cases that come to light through that process. Documents surface. Journalists begin reporting on what happened. Former residents of Fernald, who are now adults, learn for the first time that the oatmeal they ate as children in the science club contained radioactive tracers. The Massachusetts state legislature responds by convening hearings. Survivors testify. The men who were boys at Fernald in the late 1940s and early 1950s sit before legislators and describe what they remember. Some of them describe not having understood what was happening at the time. Some describe feeling that they were special because they were in the science club, only to discover decades later what the club actually was. Their testimony is recorded in the legislative record. What the hearings produce in terms of institutional response is significant compared to most of the other cases in this series. MIT acknowledges the experiments. MIT acknowledges the consent failure. MIT does not fight the core factual record. Quaker Oats, whose commercial interest in the study makes its role particularly stark, also does not dispute the basic facts when they surface. In 1998, MIT and Quaker Oats reach a financial settlement with survivors. The settlement totals $1.85 million and is distributed among approximately 30 former Fernald residents who were enrolled in the experiments. The individual payments are modest given what was done, but the settlement itself represents something that almost none of the other cases in this series produce: a financial acknowledgement from the institutions that conducted and funded the experiments that they bear responsibility for what happened. The settlement does not include any finding of criminal liability. No researcher faces criminal charges. No MIT official faces criminal charges. No Quaker Oats executive faces criminal charges. The AEC, which provided the radioisotopes, is a dissolved agency by the time the settlement happens. Its functions have been absorbed into other government bodies, and no successor agency faces liability for its role in the Fernald experiments. The broader context of the Fernald case within the history of research at the school is also documented. The MIT nutritional studies are not the only research conducted on Fernald residents during this period. The school is used for various studies across different decades. The population of institutionalized children with limited family advocates is a population that multiple research programs find attractive for the same reasons the MIT researchers do. The Fernald case is the one that receives the most attention because of the radioactive material and the Quaker Oats connection. But it sits within a broader pattern of Fernald being treated as a research resource rather than a school. The Fernald School itself continues operating for decades after the experiments. It does not close until 2014, when the last remaining residents are transitioned to community-based care settings. By the time it closes, disability rights advocates have spent 40 years arguing that institutions like Fernald, regardless of the research conducted in them, represent a fundamentally flawed model for supporting people with intellectual disabilities. The closure comes not because of the experiments, but because of a broader shift in how Massachusetts and the country think about institutional care. What the Fernald case contributes to the pattern visible across all the cases in this series is the corporate dimension made explicit. At Holmesburg, corporations pay for access to prisoners to test commercial products. At Fernald, a corporation funds research on children in an institution to generate data useful for marketing. The commercial interest is not hidden in the Fernald case. It is documented in the funding arrangements. Quaker Oats pays for a study that uses radioactive tracers in children's food, and the study is designed in a way that could produce findings favorable to Quaker Oats products. That arrangement exists because a major American corporation calculates that the children at Fernald are a suitable population for this kind of research. The calculation rests on the same foundation as every other selection decision in this series. The subjects are chosen because they cannot easily object, cannot easily seek outside help, and are unlikely to generate the kind of public attention that would shut the program down before it produces its data. The settlement MIT and Quaker Oats pay in 1998 is the closest thing to corporate accountability that any of the 10 cases in this series produces. It is $1.85 million divided among roughly 30 men. It arrives 50 years after the experiments. It comes with no admission of criminal wrongdoing and no ongoing obligation to the survivors beyond the payment itself. The men who were boys in the Fernald Science Club in the late 1940s are in their 60s when the settlement is reached. Some of them spent their entire childhood and much of their adult lives at Fernald or in other institutions. The Science Club trip to a baseball game is, for some of them, among the clearest memories they have of anything resembling a special experience during their childhood at the school. They did not know what was in the oatmeal. They knew they got to go to a game. underscore underscore quote underscore 7 underscore underscore. What comes next in this series moves away from a single institution entirely. The next case does not happen in one prison or one school or one hospital. It happens across multiple university hospitals and research facilities simultaneously, over 3 decades. And the material being used is not bacteria or hepatitis or radioactive oatmeal. It is radiation itself, delivered in doses that go far beyond any therapeutic purpose to patients who are told something very different from what is actually being done to them. Case 09. U.S. radiation experiments on burn victims and cancer patients. United States, 1940s through 1970s. This case does not have a single location. It does not have a single agency. It does not have a single researcher or a single institution or a single year when it begins and ends. It spans 3 decades, multiple universities, multiple hospitals, multiple government agencies, and thousands of patients across the country. What holds it together is not a single program with a name and a file number. It is a consistent institutional logic applied across different settings by different people who share the same foundational assumption: that certain patients in certain conditions can be exposed to radiation beyond any therapeutic purpose, without being told what is being done to them or why. Because the data their bodies produce is worth more to the institution than their right to know. The congressional subcommittee that reviews this record in 1986 publishes its findings under the title American Nuclear Guinea Pigs: 3 Decades of Radiation Experiments on U.S. Citizens. The title is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a description of the documentary record. The Cold War is the institutional context that makes all of it possible. From the late 1940s onward, the U.S. government is building a nuclear arsenal and managing a workforce of hundreds of thousands of people who work with radioactive materials. The military is planning for the possibility of nuclear warfare. It needs to know what radiation does to human beings at various doses, how quickly it incapacitates a soldier, what dose level is survivable, how the body responds to whole-body exposure versus localized exposure, and what long-term consequences different levels of exposure produce. Animal studies exist, but military and AEC officials consistently argue that animal data is insufficient for the decisions they need to make. They need human data. The hospitals and universities that conduct the experiments are not coerced into participation. They receive funding from the Army and the AEC in exchange for conducting research on their patient populations. The funding is significant. For medical institutions in the post-war period, federal research dollars represent a major source of operational revenue. The relationship between the government agencies that want the data and the institutions that produce it is financial as much as scientific. The patients on whom the research is conducted are not told they are participants in military-funded radiation experiments. They are told they are receiving treatment, or they are told nothing at all. The Medical College of Virginia case is one of the most thoroughly documented examples of what this looks like in practice. The patients selected at the Medical College of Virginia are severe burn victims. They arrive at the hospital with traumatic injuries, burns covering large portions of their bodies, injuries that are already life-threatening and extraordinarily painful. The majority of them are poor. The majority of them are black. They are at the hospital because they need emergency medical care and they have nowhere else to go. What happens to them there goes beyond treatment for their burns. The researchers at the Medical College of Virginia working with Army and AEC funding, subject these patients to additional procedures that have nothing to do with treating their burns. They inject some patients with radioactive phosphorus-32. The amounts injected into some patients reach 500 microcuries. The researchers' own documents establish that 500 microcuries of phosphorus-32 is approximately 50 times the dose considered acceptable for a healthy person with no existing injuries. These patients are not healthy people with no existing injuries. They are severe burn victims with compromised immune systems, damaged skin barriers, and bodies already under extreme physiological stress. For people in that condition, the additional radiation burden almost certainly increases their mortality risk. The researchers know this. They proceed anyway. The patients are not told about the injections. They are not told what is in the injections. They are not told the injections are part of a military-funded experiment. They are burn victims in a hospital, dependent entirely on the medical staff treating them, with no capacity to investigate what is being done to their bodies while they are fighting to survive their injuries. The Johns Hopkins case involves a different population and a different method, but the same absence of meaningful disclosure. Between 1948 and 1954, 582 children in Baltimore are enrolled in a study at Johns Hopkins Hospital. These are not hospitalized children. They are school children from Baltimore brought to the hospital as part of what is described to their families as a program to address recurring ear and nasal problems. The procedure the researchers use is the insertion of radium rods into the children's nasal passages. Radium rods are small applicators containing radium-226, a radioactive material that emits radiation to the surrounding tissue. The procedure is called nasopharyngeal irradiation, and it has been used as a treatment for certain ear and sinus conditions, though its efficacy is disputed even at the time. What makes the Johns Hopkins program research rather than treatment is the scale, the systematic data collection, and the fact that many of the children receiving the procedure do not have the specific conditions it is purportedly designed to treat. The program is federally funded. The children and their parents are not given full information about the radioactive nature of the rods or the experimental character of the program. They are told the children are receiving treatment. The same procedure is used on over 70 U.S. military personnel during the same period. Soldiers and sailors experiencing ear problems related to pressure changes, submarine duty, high-altitude flight, are given nasopharyngeal irradiation as a purported treatment. They are not told the procedure is experimental. They are not told about the radiation. They are in the military, operating within a chain of command, and they receive the procedure as a medical order rather than a choice. Decades later, follow-up studies find elevated rates of head and neck cancers among people who received nasopharyngeal irradiation during this period. The causal relationship is not simple to establish with certainty because the exposed populations are difficult to track completely across decades. But the finding is consistent enough across multiple follow-up efforts that it becomes part of the documented medical literature on radiation-induced cancer risk. The Vanderbilt University case involves pregnant women. In the late 1940s, pregnant women receiving prenatal care at Vanderbilt University's clinic are given drinks containing radioactive iron as part of a nutritional study examining iron absorption during pregnancy. The women are not told the drinks contain radioactive material. Some of the women are told the drinks are vitamins. The study is federally funded. The immediate effects on the women themselves are not systematically recorded in the surviving documents in a way that allows full reconstruction of what they experienced. What is documented in follow-up research conducted years later is the effect on their children. Studies tracking the children born to women who received the radioactive iron drinks find higher than expected rates of cancer and other health problems compared to children born to women who did not receive them. 4 children of women in the study are documented as having died of cancers that researchers in the follow-up work consider potentially linked to their prenatal radiation exposure. A class action lawsuit is filed on behalf of the women and their families. Vanderbilt University settles the case for $10.3 million. The settlement is reached without any admission of criminal wrongdoing. No researcher faces criminal charges. The University of Cincinnati program runs from 1960 to 1971 and is among the most extensively reviewed of all the cases in the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments 1995 report. The subjects at Cincinnati are cancer patients. Nearly 200 of them over the course of the program. The majority are poor. The majority are black. They are patients at the University of Cincinnati's hospital seeking treatment for their cancers. What they receive, without being told, is whole-body radiation in doses that exceed what any therapeutic radiation protocol would use. The doses range up to 300 rads of whole-body radiation delivered in a single session. For context, the lethal dose of whole-body radiation for approximately half of exposed humans, what radiation physicists call the LD50, is in the range of 400 to 500 rads. The doses being delivered at Cincinnati are in the range of 60 to 80% of the amount that kills half the people who receive it. The patients are told they are receiving treatment for their cancer. They are not told the radiation doses being used are experimental and far beyond standard therapeutic levels. They are not told the study is funded by the Department of Defense, which wants data on how radiation affects human performance and survival. Data relevant to planning for nuclear warfare scenarios, not data designed to help the patients being irradiated. Dr. Eugene Sanger runs the Cincinnati program. His research interest is genuine. He publishes extensively on radiation medicine throughout his career. The Defense Department's interest in his work is also genuine. His data on high-dose whole-body radiation effects is directly applicable to military planning for nuclear combat scenarios. What connects Sanger's scientific interest and the Defense Department's military interest is the patient population at Cincinnati, which provides the human subjects through whom both interests are served. Those patients are told they are being treated. The gap between what they are told and what is actually happening to them is the same gap that appears in every case in this series. The 1995 Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments is established by President Clinton following the wave of disclosures triggered by Wellsome's reporting and O'Leary's declassification initiative. The committee is chaired by Ruth Faden of the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics. It reviews thousands of documents across the full range of radiation experiments conducted on American citizens from the 1940s through the 1970s. Faden's public statement when the committee releases its final report is precise and direct. She states that the committee has found that wrongs were indeed committed, both with experiments involving radiation and with the intentional releases of radiation into the environment. Patients were used as subjects of experiments without their knowledge or consent. Information was withheld from affected communities and from the public. Secrets were kept to protect the government from embarrassment and legal liability. That last phrase is the one that matters most in terms of understanding the institutional record. Secrets were kept to protect the government from embarrassment and legal liability, not to protect national security, not because disclosure would compromise ongoing operations, to protect the government from embarrassment and legal liability. The April 1947 AEC memorandum that recommends keeping the plutonium injection experiments secret uses almost identical language. The institutional motivation for concealment across different agencies and different decades is consistent. It is not security, it is accountability avoidance. The prison cases add another dimension to the radiation experiment record. In Oregon, male prisoners at the Oregon State Penitentiary have their testicles irradiated with X-rays as part of a study examining radiation's effects on human fertility and reproductive cells. The study runs from 1963 to 1973 under the direction of Dr. Carl Heller, funded in part by the Atomic Energy Commission. Prisoners receive between 8 and 600 rads of X-ray radiation to their testes. The lower end of that range is within what might be considered a research dose. The upper end, 600 rads to the testes, is not. Participants are paid between $5 and $10 per month, plus $25 for each testicular biopsy. In a prison environment in the 1960s, that payment is not trivial. But the same analysis that applies to Holmesburg applies here. Payment in a coercive institutional environment does not constitute free consent. The men are informed that the radiation may cause sterility, but they are not fully informed of the cancer risks associated with scrotal irradiation at the doses being used. Follow-up studies on participants find elevated rates of testicular cancer in the decades after the study ends. A parallel program runs at Washington State Penitentiary under Dr. C. Alvin Paulson during the same period, also funded by the AEC, using the same methods on a similar prisoner population. Neither Heller nor Paulson faces criminal charges. The programs end in 1973, following the wave of scrutiny that the exposure of other non-consensual research programs generates in the early 1970s. The full financial accounting for the radiation experiments across all sites is partial and inconsistent. The plutonium injection settlements total $4.8 million across 12 subjects. The Vanderbilt settlement is $10.3 million. Individual settlements and DOE administrative compensation payments reach other affected individuals and families through various channels. No single comprehensive compensation program covers all the people affected by all the experiments documented in the Congressional and Advisory Committee records. The 1986 Congressional Subcommittee Report and the 1995 Advisory Committee Report together constitute the most complete public accounting of what happened. Both documents confirm the pattern the individual cases illustrate. The subjects are disproportionately poor, black, institutionalized, or otherwise structurally vulnerable. The consents obtained, where any consent process exists at all, are not genuine, informed consents. They do not disclose the experimental nature of the procedures, the military funding, or the actual risks involved. The data produced serves military and governmental interests. The subjects receive no benefit from the research conducted on their bodies, and in many cases are actively harmed by it. What the Advisory Committee adds beyond the individual case findings is a structural analysis. It concludes that the problem is not a collection of individual researchers who made bad ethical choices. It is a system, a set of institutional relationships between government agencies, universities, hospitals, and the military that created the conditions in which these choices were made routinely, across multiple sites, over multiple decades, without generating internal accountability. The system does not produce one Tuskegee. It produces Tuskegee and San Francisco, and MK Ultra, and the plutonium injections, and Willowbrook, and Holmesburg, and Fernald, and Cincinnati, and Oregon, and Vanderbilt, and Johns Hopkins, and the Medical College of Virginia, and Guatemala, and Terre Haute, all running simultaneously or in sequence, connected by funding streams, personnel, institutional logic, and the shared assumption that the people being experimented on are not in a position to stop it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That assumption is what the final case in this series examines most directly. The last case is not the most dramatic. It is not the largest in scale, but it is the one that makes the clearest documentary record of the institutional chain. How one program leads to another, how the same people move between them, and how the same logic that produces an experiment on American prisoners in Indiana in 1943 produces an experiment on Guatemalan psychiatric patients in 1947 and an experiment on black sharecroppers in Alabama that runs until 1972. The thread connecting all of it is not coincidence. It is the same institution, the same people, and the same decision made over and over again across 3 decades. Case 10. The Terre Haute Prison Syphilis Tests. Terre Haute, Indiana, 1943. The United States is at war. The military is losing soldiers not just to enemy fire, but to sexually transmitted diseases at rates that alarm the War Department. Gonorrhea alone puts tens of thousands of American soldiers out of action every year. The military wants a chemical solution, a compound that a soldier can apply or take after a sexual encounter that will prevent infection from taking hold. Something practical, fast, and deployable in the field without requiring a doctor. The U.S. Public Health Service is given the task of finding it. The approach they settle on is straightforward in its logic and indefensible in its execution. To test whether a compound prevents gonorrhea infection after exposure, you need subjects who have been exposed to gonorrhea. You cannot test prevention without infection. So the researchers decide to create the infection themselves in a controlled setting in human subjects and then apply the experimental compounds to see which ones work. The subjects they choose are federal prisoners at the Federal Correctional Institution in Terre Haute, Indiana. The program is approved at the highest levels of the public health establishment. Thomas Perrin, the 6th Surgeon General of the United States, approves it. Colonel John A. Rogers, Executive Officer of the U.S. Army Medical Corps, approves it. These are not rogue researchers operating outside institutional sanction. This is a program authorized by the Surgeon General of the United States and the U.S. Army, running inside a federal prison, on prisoners who are in no meaningful position to refuse. The prisoners are told they are participating in medical research. They are told the research is important for the war effort. Some accounts indicate they are offered small benefits for participation. What they are not told with clarity is the full nature of what will happen to their bodies, the specific risks involved, and the fact that the experimental compounds being tested on them have no established safety record in humans. The infection method is direct inoculation. Researchers introduce gonorrhea bacteria directly into the bodies of the prisoners. This is not accidental exposure or the use of infected partners as an intermediary step. It is a clinical procedure in which researchers take a pathogen and put it inside a human being who does not have it, for the purpose of then testing whether a chemical compound can prevent the infection from developing. The program runs into a fundamental problem. Consistent infection rates are difficult to achieve. Not every inoculation produces an active gonorrhea infection. The human immune system sometimes clears the bacteria before an infection establishes itself. This variability makes the data from each experimental trial inconsistent. Researchers cannot reliably compare the performance of different preventive compounds if the baseline infection rate is not stable. This problem, the inconsistency of infection rates in the Terre Haute prisoner population, is documented in the program's own records as the primary scientific justification for moving the research to Guatemala 3 years later. The Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues, reviewing the full documentary record in 2011, confirms this directly. The Guatemala program is established in part because researchers believe they can achieve more consistent infection rates in a different institutional setting using different methods. But the Commission's report identifies a second reason for moving the program that is at least as important as the scientific one. The researchers moved to Guatemala specifically to avoid the ethical constraints related to individual consent, other adverse legal consequences, and bad publicity that operating on American soil produces. The Terre Haute program, even with prisoners as subjects, generates internal concern about scrutiny. The solution is not to address those concerns by improving the ethical standards of the research. The solution is to take the research somewhere those concerns do not apply. John Cutler participates in the Terre Haute program. He then leads the Guatemala program. He then becomes a principal researcher on the Tuskegee syphilis study, which is already running when he joins it, and continues until 1972. The same man moves through 3 separate programs over 3 decades, each one involving the deliberate infection or deliberate denial of treatment to human subjects without genuine informed consent, each one connected to the others through the institutional network of the U.S. Public Health Service. John Mahoney is another central figure in the Terre Haute program. He is the primary supervisor of the gonorrhea infection experiments. In 1946, while the Guatemala syphilis program that grows directly out of Terre Haute is actively running, Mahoney receives the Lasker Award, one of the most prestigious prizes in American medicine. He receives it for his work demonstrating that penicillin is an effective treatment for syphilis. The award is given to him for research that establishes a cure for the disease that John Cutler is simultaneously and deliberately infecting people with in Guatemala. The Lasker Award is not given to a figure on the margins of American medicine. It is given to a man at the center of it, who is being honored for one line of work while conducting another line of work that would, if fully known at the time, have made the award impossible. The 2 lines of work are happening simultaneously. Nobody giving the award knows about Guatemala. Nobody is supposed to know. The Terre Haute program produces data. The data is analyzed. Papers are written. The program is referenced in internal government documents as a basis for the Guatemala work. But the Terre Haute experiments are never published in a way that describes the methods fully and transparently enough for the medical community to evaluate what was done. The results are used internally. The methods are kept within the institutional network. When the Guatemala experiments are exposed in 2010 through Susan Reverby's archival discovery and the subsequent government response, the Terre Haute program surfaces as part of the documentary record. The Presidential Commission's 2011 report, Ethically Impossible, examines both programs together and documents the institutional chain connecting them. The Commission finds that the Terre Haute experiments, while less extreme in their methods than what Cutler does in Guatemala, establish the institutional precedent and the personnel network that makes Guatemala possible. The Commission's language about the institutional chain is precise. It describes the progression from Terre Haute to Guatemala to Tuskegee not as a series of isolated incidents produced by individual researchers making individual bad choices, but as evidence of a systemic pattern within the U.S. Public Health Service. The same institution, the same funding streams, the same personnel in some cases, the same foundational logic applied to different populations across different settings over 3 decades. That systemic pattern is what the Commission is most concerned with establishing. Individual cases can be explained away as aberrations. A documented chain of programs connected by personnel and institutional logic running continuously for 30 years cannot. The subjects at Terre Haute are federal prisoners. Like the subjects at Holmesburg, like the subjects at the Oregon and Washington state penitentiaries in the radiation experiments, they are in a setting that fundamentally compromises the voluntariness of any consent they give. A prisoner cannot freely choose whether to participate in a medical experiment run by people who have institutional authority over their daily lives, their medical care, and in some cases, their recommendations for early release or other benefits. The coercive structure of imprisonment does not disappear because a researcher offers payment or describes the research as voluntary. This point is not a modern retrospective judgment imposed on a different era. It is a point that was understood and debated within the research community at the time. The American Medical Association issues a statement in 1946, the same year the Guatemala program begins, establishing that prisoner research requires genuine voluntary consent free from coercion. The Nuremberg Code, established in 1947, states the same principle even more forcefully. These standards exist contemporaneously with the Terre Haute program. The researchers running Terre Haute are not operating in an ethical vacuum where no standards exist. They are operating in a context where standards exist and where their program does not meet them. The fact that the program is approved by the Surgeon General and the Army does not change this. Institutional approval is not the same as ethical compliance. The Nuremberg Tribunal makes this point explicitly in the context of the German medical experiments. The fact that those experiments were authorized by the Nazi state does not make them ethical. The same logic applies to programs authorized by the U.S. Surgeon General that violate the contemporaneous standards for voluntary consent. No one involved in the Terre Haute program is ever prosecuted. No one is formally sanctioned. The program is not publicly disclosed during the lifetimes of most of the researchers involved. When it surfaces as part of the 2010 and 2011 disclosures related to Guatemala, the primary figures are long dead. Cutler dies in 2003. Mahoney dies in 1957. Perrin dies in 1968. The institutional accountability that never comes during their lifetimes cannot come after them. The prisoners at Terre Haute who are infected with gonorrhea in 1943 and 1944 are not a named population in the historical record the way some of the subjects in other cases are. There is no Eb Cade equivalent, no individual whose name and story is preserved in enough detail to anchor the case in a specific human life. The Terre Haute subjects are documented as a population in research records. Their individual identities, their outcomes, their long-term health consequences, and what they understood about what was being done to them are not preserved in the documents that survive. This is itself part of the record. The people used as subjects in these programs are systematically less documented as individuals than the programs that use them. The research records describe methods, doses, infection rates, and compound performance. They do not describe the men as people. They do not record what the men thought was happening. They do not follow up on what the experience cost them. The institutional record keeps what is useful to the institution and discards what is not. The men's humanity is not useful to the institution, so it is not recorded. What the 10 cases in this series share, viewed together from the position of the final one, is a structure that repeats across every variation of setting, method, agency, and era. A population is identified. The population has some characteristic that makes it vulnerable to institutional authority and unlikely to generate effective resistance. Poverty, race, imprisonment, disability, age, foreign nationality, institutionalization, or some combination of these. A research program is designed that requires human subjects and that the researchers understand cannot be conducted with genuinely informed and freely given consent, either because the methods are too obviously harmful or because the subjects would refuse if they knew what was planned. The program proceeds anyway, justified by an institutional goal: military preparedness, disease research, weapons development, product testing, that the institution places above the rights of the subjects. The program is concealed from public scrutiny through classification, selective publication, or simply the absence of any mechanism for the subjects to report what is happening to them. When exposure eventually comes, it comes through external pressure. A whistleblower, a journalist, an archivist, a congressional investigation, not through internal accountability. The legal and criminal consequences for the researchers and officials involved are minimal or non-existent. The financial consequences, where they occur, arrive decades late and fall far short of the harm caused. That structure is not the story of 10 programs. It is the story of one logic, expressed 10 times in 10 different settings. The National Research Act of 1974, the Belmont Report of 1979, the Institutional Review Board system that now governs human research in the United States, all of it exists because these programs happened. The oversight infrastructure that protects research subjects today is built directly on the evidence of what happens when that infrastructure does not exist. Every IRB approval, every informed consent form, every ethics review of a research protocol is, in a direct institutional sense, a consequence of Tuskegee and Guatemala and MKUltra and the plutonium injections, and Willowbrook, and Holmesburg, and Fernald, and Cincinnati, and Terre Haute, and San Francisco. The reforms are real. The system that exists now is meaningfully different from the system that made these programs possible. That is true, and it matters. What is also true is that the reforms arrive after the harm. They are built on the bodies of the people used before the rules existed. The 600 men in Macon County. The 800,000 people in San Francisco who inhaled bacteria from a Navy ship they could not see. The unwitting subjects in CIA safe houses who did not know what was in their drinks. Eb Cade, whose broken bones were left unset for 20 days so researchers could take better samples. Berta, whose name survives only in a researcher's clinical notes. The children at Willowbrook who drank chocolate milk mixed with infected fecal matter. The men at Holmesburg whose skin Kligman describes as acres of fertile field. The boys at Fernald who thought they had joined a science club. The burn victims at the Medical College of Virginia who were injected with radiation on top of their injuries. The prisoners at Terre Haute who were infected with gonorrhea for a military program that then moved to Guatemala when the infection rates were not consistent enough. These are not abstractions. They are the specific human cost of the specific institutional decisions documented across these 10 cases. The cost is recorded. The accountability, in most cases, is not. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.